The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to John.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at the table with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. You bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. It is my great joy and our great privilege to welcome back Rabbi Sandra Cohen as our guest preacher.
I keep reading Claire, but I keep forgetting that the Psalm of the Day is one that she actually knows. It's the Psalm that Jews sing before the grace after meals on Shabbat and festival.
All right.
That's just a coincidence.
You're going to need to speak a little louder and probably.
Let's be loud.
Sorry. Let's be loud.
Let's be loud.
Sorry.
When my daughter Shira headed off to college, we talked about many things: drinking, sex, finding community, finding a Jewish community, and meeting new people, most of whom were not going to be Jewish. She had grown up the daughter of a rabbi, going to Jewish day school and Jewish kids. All of these new faiths around her would be a different experience for her. I urged her to take a New Testament class because these are the stories that animate much of American life, religious and culturally. I encouraged her to go to church with her friends to discover other rituals in other religions. She ended up joining what they had at her school was a kosher halal co-op, where Jews and Muslims who were observant got together and made food for each other and ate. So, how do I behave in church, she asked. Well, I told her, you stand when they stand, you sit when they sit because when they kneel, because Jews only kneel once a year on Yom Kippur, you sit. And no matter what the officiant says, you cannot go up for a snack. So, communion is for Jews a mystery and puzzlement. As an outside observer, following a college class on Christianity, I would eagerly go up to anyone who identified as Christian and say, "What do you think happens at communion?" Having a best friend who's an Episcopal priest helps. I ask the questions over and over again, seeking to understand a religious language that is so different than my own. You have to eat the host and the wine, or else you bury the remains. Okay. In Judaism, we have shemos piles, shemot, collections of any papers with God's name on it. And from time to time, when that pile gets too big, we bury these holy places in the cemetery, a geniza. While the Torah and other religious texts are not God, the way we understand God speaking to us from our texts might parallel God's presence in the wine and bread. Or not. So earlier this year, I was roped into teaching against my better judgment an interfaith study group made up primarily of members of my home congregation, Yod Shalom, and St. Luke's Episcopal Church, the one in Denver. This group of dedicated, mostly older folks have been learning each other's traditions for several years now, taking things on in 6-week intervals, such as texts from Job, the Sermon on the Mount, the Gospel of John. They reached out to me because my shul's rabbi is no longer involved in the group, and while there are 2 priests there from St. Luke's, they wanted my presence. So interfaith study can be great. The reasons I did not wish to teach this class range from my subject and my interest and expertise on the subject matter, by the fact that they meet in the evening, which is not the best time of my day. They seduced me, however, by saying we can learn Talmud, which I love to learn and to teach. And they even offered to pay me because I don't have a day job. So I met with one of the priests to talk about the syllabus. The group looks for accessible books with backgrounds on subject matter, and the book we selected, also over my better instincts, was just that. It explained really well in layman's terms what the Talmud is, its historical setting, enumerated parts of the Talmud. If you want to know more, we can talk later. It then features texts from what are these 6 orders of the Mishnah in small, absorbable little chunks, each with a religious or ethical takeaway. So during the last class, we were studying a text about free will. The sages teach Hakol b'yadei Shemayim includes Yirat Shemayim. Everything is in the hands of heaven except for the fear of heaven. We went back and forth about the interpretations about this until Father Gordy asked, why is this piece in a tractate of the Talmud that is supposed to be about Midah, about women's menstrual cycles? A good question, I said with a very long answer. But his question underlined my struggle to teach Talmud this way. Talmud is a recording, if you will, of the sages, of the rabbis talking with each other, with earlier generations, and it flows like a conversation, with tangents and byways. If the text tells us, say, that Rabbi Yochanan says something about cooking on Shabbat, the Talmud might then continue with 4 or 5 things that Rabbi Yochanan taught, not necessarily related to cooking on the Sabbath. And then what other thoughts of Rabbi Yochanan's teaching, until suddenly you're discussing dreams and their interpretations, and then abruptly the Gemara, the later part of the Talmud, returns to the subject at hand. So Father Gordy then asked the Jewish students in the class if they accessed the Talmud when they had a question about Jewish law or thought. And the Jews laughed. The Talmud is huge. If you read one dot, that is one double-sided page, 2A and 2B, one page a day, it takes 7.5 years to read the entire Talmud. And it's only, as I said, theoretically organized by topic. Plus, there's been a lot of development of Jewish thought and law in the past 1,500 years. So for instructions on how to Jewish, we have law codes, books, and in most denominations, the ability for she'elot and tshuvot, the ability for questions and answers, which allows rabbis to bring ancient wisdom, rabbinical tradition, and modern issues together. You don't read the Talmud, you learn it bit by bit. And so in teaching these earnest, well-meaning people Talmud in bite-sized chunks, give them no real sense of how the Talmud really works as an ongoing discussion of what we would call the written Torah, the Bible. They don't have a sense of what in some ways it means to be Jewish, how Jews think. They didn't get to see the rabbinic comfort with paradox and with arguments. They didn't have the experience of jumping into the Talmud mid-conversation, because wherever you begin, the rabbis assume you have already read ahead. So it was Talmud, but not really. So when Claire sent me the lectionary for this Sunday, she noted, well, with a smile, an online smile, the, shall we say, difficult nature of the epistle. Paul begins proclaiming what a good Jew he is. He follows the commandments, he's a rabbinic Jew, not one of those problematic Sadducees or Essenes. He even persecutes Jewish Christians around him as being fundamentally mistaken. But then comes the kicker. This, it seems, following the law, fulfilling all these mitzvot, commandments, this is all pointless. Instead of feeling closer to God, all this contradictory concentration on acts and behavior keeps him from experiencing redemption. He says, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but one that comes through faith in Christ, righteousness from God based on faith. And it appears here that we have to choose justification by faith or by works. That sounds, I know, at least to me, like language from the Protestant Revolution. But it also is that which separates Jews and Christians. To put it starkly, does it matter what one believes or what one does? Jews are not great at theology. We have some assertions, like the Shema, which is said 2-3 times a day, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is your God, the Lord is one. That's our biggie. And certainly things that can place you outside normative Judaism, such as the communion service we're about to experience. But mostly Jews focus on acts. For example, to be considered an Orthodox Jew, there's little dots, right? Theology, but a lot of orthoprax, things you have to do, deeds. The big three, the kind of shorthand is shomer kashrut, keeping kosher, shomer Shabbat, observing the Sabbath, and shomer midah, observant of menstrual purity and impurity in one's sexual life. I mean, not all Jews, of course, are observant Jews, even in those progressive denominations of Judaism. We have ethnic Jews and liberal Jews, Jews who focus on learning, Jews who focus on social action. We are a religion, but also a people. You can convert in, but you can never leave. Christianity, from what I can tell from the outside, is at least in theory about belief. Paul contrasts the mitzvot, the commandments that the early rabbis promoted, with the saving grace of acknowledging Jesus. The mitzvot, commandments, only give him an opportunity to sin. If you have observed a commandment incorrectly, accidentally or on purpose, you can be punished for that. But instead of following the endless thou shalt and thou shalt not, one can find righteousness through the acceptance of Jesus, and they even partake of Jesus' resurrection of the dead. And I could be wrong about this, of course. You don't really need a rabbi coming to tell you how to be a good Christian. Although, if you don't want me to do that, you need to stop inviting me down. Here are the things I know. Jews do see the laws, the system of chukim u'mishpatim, of ordinances and laws, as a blessing, not a burden. Twice daily, Jews say a prayer about revelation, about the giving of Torah, the Bible. And what do the prayers say? God has loved us with an abiding love, an everlasting love. And that love for us is made manifest not through a Messiah, but by giving us Torah. John Clayton writes, with a great love, Ahava Rabbah, you, O God, have loved us. The love of God for the people of Israel is declared here right before the Shema. It prepares us to affirm God's unity. Now, you might be expecting a listing of gifts to us. God's freeing us, God's feeding us, delivering us. But instead, we thank God for one gift, God's teachings, God's opening our minds and our hearts to Torah. What you've given us is the ability to listen to you so that we can thank and draw close to you. Your compassion is expressed in teaching our hearts to know compassion, to love you, giving us not personal freedoms, but boundaries, bringing us close to the unbounded, the one. By giving us Torah, you have shown us how to live. And we can now offer thanks and say, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. So where Paul feels burdened, Jews feel blessed. Every mitzvah, every rule is a chance for us to know God and become close to God. What I eat, how I pray, the way I know to visit the sick and welcome the stranger, all these rules and obligations, whether ritual or ethical, they come from God through the Torah and a later unfolding of what we call oral law. 613 mitzvot. Jews all agree we have been commanded. There are 365 negative mitzvot, thou shalt not, corresponding, of course, to something you should not do each day of the solar year. And there are as well 248 positive commandments, thou shalt, which correspond to the rabbinic understanding of the number of limbs in the body. Something to refrain from each day, and a way to use our bodies and ourselves each day to positively serve God. Are there too many? Yeah, probably. Adding them in minhagim, the Jewish customs, and you've got to feel overwhelmed. That's why it's hard to convert to Judaism. So many rules, and sometimes so little spirituality. But when you grow up with it, or you even slowly achieve it, there is observances over the years, it comes to feel natural. I learned as an adult this custom about putting on shoes. You put on the right one, and then you put on the left one, you tie the left one, and then you tie the right one. What does it symbolize? Who knows? That's not quite true. It has to do with God's attribute of justice versus God's attribute of righteousness, of compassion, and putting the things, but yeah. But you know what? It makes me feel Jewish when I get dressed. Another story of my darling child. When she was in about 5th grade, she was assigned a project in comparing nutritional facts among 2 or more popular restaurants. So she was using the computer in my study, exploring menus at Burger King and McDonald's, neither of which she had ever been to because they keep kosher and there's nothing gross. Ew, gross, she proclaimed loudly. I ran up to the study and said, what? She says, who would put cheese on a hamburger? My little kosher child had never heard of such a thing. It was like putting pickles on ice cream. When we grow up with, we know what we grow up with, even if you make different choices as adults. I'm more Jewishly observant than my parents were. That they gave me a base from which to grow. They said Judaism is not just a religion, it's a faith, it's a culture, it's a country, it's an ethnicity, it's a community, and I am blessed because of it. I have a religious language I speak, and you all have a different. Claire and I have been blessed to be talking with one another about our faiths, our ritual and rite, our ethical obligations in our communities for 35 years. And we have, in so many ways, just begun to understand each other. Paul's rejections of commandments in favor of faith is part of the basis of the early Christian church. Those folks who hung around near the early synagogues, attracted to Jewish faith, both ritual and ethics, but chose not to convert for many reasons, including the fact that you had to be circumcised. So for them, Paul's identification of justification by faith becomes very attractive. You did not need to be Jewish to become Christian. A non-Jew could become Jewish Christian right away. This enabled the mission to the Gentiles, the spreading of the story of Jesus. It was, or at least it seems to me, as an outsider, a brilliant marketing move. As well as a complete definition of how to be a non-monotheist in the early decades and centuries of the Common Era. And so Jews often misunderstand the Christian concept of grace. How is it, Jews wonder, that all Christians have to do is accept Jesus? What about acts? What about righteous behavior? For Christians, as I understand it, God's grace in accepting a person, just as she is, sinful, flawed, and broken, that very grace comes and changes a person and makes us more righteous in our behavior. Faith comes first, but it's followed by acts. And Jews do it the other way. I may not know God, but at any given moment I have a choice to act as Judaism tells me to or not. To follow God's commandments, or instead to indulge my yetzer hara and evil inclination. Is one better than the other? And I suspect not, but they are different. Being Jewish is hard, but being Christian is also hard in different ways. Rabbi Dick Greenberg, a modern Orthodox rabbi who spent his career trying to bridge Jewish divides, said, it doesn't matter which denomination you belong to, as long as you're ashamed of it. Reform Judaism emphasizes social justice while downplaying ritual observance. Orthodox Judaism, just the opposite. Every branch has something to contribute and something to learn. I expect that's true also among monotheistic faiths or any faiths. You have this beautiful story of God so loving humanity that God comes to live among us as a person. And for that story, in some ways, I have what they call holy envy. I appreciate your story, can even long for that sort of intimacy. But that is your story, not mine. And I can only live out my story. I thank you for allowing me over these many years to be with you in your rituals and faith, teaching me to pass the peace and making sure that there's chocolate for me at coffee hour. In those moments when we acknowledge the humanity of the other, when we indulge in the kinds of sweets after worship that is common to both our faiths, we make bridges, we make connections. That, my friends, is holy work. May the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable before you, O God, our rock and our redeemer. And we say, Amen.
Amen.